Welcome back to this next video, and in this video we are going to talk about the neuronal signaling or the synaptic signaling. And this neuronal or synaptic signaling is one of the unique examples of the paracrine signaling. Before going into the neuronal signaling, I'll briefly give you an overview of the types of the signaling. Now, one of the important type of the signaling that is known is the endocrine signaling, in which an endocrine cell that release a hormone into the bloodstream, and that particular hormone utilizes the bloodstream as a media to move from its producing cells into the target cell on which the receptor for that particular hormone is present. So when the hormone that interacts with its particular receptor, a cellular response is generated. Another important type of the signaling that is known is the paracrine signaling. And in the paracrine signaling, the producing cell, if you can see this particular cell, this is the signaling cell. That means this is producing the signaling, and when it produces the signal, the signal are going to bind to receptors on the cells, and when they bind to these cells having the receptor for this particular signal, a cellular response that will be generated. Now, the basic difference between these two, the endocrine and the paracrine signaling, is that in the endocrine signaling, the producing cell which is producing the signal and the receiving cell, they are physically very far away from each other. They have got a lot of physical distance between them. In the paracrine signaling, the signaling cell which is producing the signal and the receiving cell which is having this receptor, they are present physically very close to each other. So you can call this as a short range signaling, and you can call this endocrine signaling as a long range signaling. Now, when we talk about this neuronal signaling, in the neuronal signaling, one of the neuron that is going to release the neurotransmitter when it receives a signal, and when it releases the neurotransmitter are going to bind to the other neuron, which is known as the postsynaptic neuron. And when it binds over there, when the neurotransmitter interacts with the receptor, cellular response that will be generated. So this will be the focus of this particular video. Another type of the signaling is known as the contact dependent signaling, in which the membrane bound signal molecule that actually go and that interacts with the target cell. So here the signal molecule that will not be released, the signal molecule that will be presented on the surface of the cell. So the whole cells, they are going to interact with each other. Now, this is an overview. I have a detailed video on the types of the signaling, and I'll share the link in the description. So when you talk about the neuronal signaling or the synaptic signaling, it is one of the unique examples of the paracrine signaling. What I mean by that is that the producing cell and the receiving cell, or the producing neuron and the receiving neuron, they are physically very close to each other. Therefore, the neuronal signaling or the synaptic signaling, that will be an example of the paracrine signaling. And in this paracrine signaling, the nerve cells, they are going to transmit signals. Now, this process is named for the synapse, which is actually the junction between two nerve cells where the signal transmission occur. The terms that will be very much clear in a while, what the synapse mean or what the presynaptic or postsynaptic neuron mean, that will be clear in a moment. Now, what happens is that when the sending neuron, or the you can say producing neuron, which is called is the presynaptic neuron, when that fires, what I mean by fire is that when the presynaptic neuron that receives a signal, that is going to create an action potential, and that is actually called is the firing of the neuron. Now, when the sending neuron or this presynaptic neuron that fires, an electrical impulse moves rapidly through the cell, traveling down a long fiber-like extension, which is called is the axon. Now, when the impulse reaches the axon terminal, it triggers the release of the neurotransmitters, which are actually the signaling molecules which quickly cross the small gap between the nerve cells, and this small gap between these nerve cells is called is the synaptic cleft. Now, when the neurotransmitter arrives at the receiving cell or the receiving neuron, which is also called is the postsynaptic neuron. These neurotransmitters are going to bind to the receptor which are present on this postsynaptic neuron, and when they bind over there, a chemical change inside the cell that is going to happen. And often this chemical change inside the cell is the opening of the ion channels and changing the electrical potential across the membrane. Don't worry about this axon terminal. I'll have a detailed discussion on this when we discuss the structure of the neuron in a while. Now this is what is happening in the neuronal signaling. Now this one is the sending neuron, or this one is the presynaptic neuron. Now in the this axon terminal at the end of this sending neuron, or the end of the presynaptic neuron, they are called is the axon terminals. And at the axon terminals you have got these neurotransmitter vesicles. This whole structure is called a vesicle, and inside the vesicle there are neurotransmitters. So the neurotransmitters are actually present in this vesicle, and they are not present freely at the end of the axon terminal. So when the sending cells that receives a message, and that message travel down the axon terminal, that signal is actually responsible for the fusion of this neurotransmitter vesicle with this membrane, this presynaptic membrane. And when they fuse over there, the neurotransmitter, they are going to be released in this small gap, and this small gap between the sending cell and the receiving cell, or the presynaptic neuron and the postsynaptic neuron, the small gap is called is the synaptic cleft. So the sending cell, when it receives a message, that is going to release the neurotransmitter into this synaptic cleft. When these neurotransmitters, they are released over here, you can see that on these receiving cells there are receptors for these neurotransmitters, and when these neurotransmitters, they binds to these receptor, chemical change is going to happen in this receiving cell. As I've told you, this change can be in the form of opening of the ion channel, or changes in the changing in the electrical potential of the receiving cells. Now what happens is, when the neurotransmitter, they bind to this receptor and a signal is generated, so you do not want the attachment of this neurotransmitter to this receptor permanently. This interaction is for a very short time, and once the response that is generated, the neurotransmitters, they are quickly degraded, or they are taken back up by this particular sending cell. The importance of this mechanism, the degradation or taken up by the sending cell, is that it resets the system so that the synapse is prepared to respond quickly to the next signal. So in this particular video, I'll be focusing on the structure and the types of the neuron, and in the next video, I'll be talking about the functions of the neuron, how they are responsible for the transfer of message from the presynaptic neuron to the postsynaptic neuron, and hence a cellular response. So when you talk about the structure of a neuron, they are the basic building blocks of the brain and the central nervous system. These neurons, they are specialized cells that transmit chemical and electrical signal. Now the brain is made up entirely of the neurons and the glial cells. So these neurons, they are actually responsible for the transmission of chemical and the electrical signals, and these glial cells, which are also called is the non-neuronal cells, they actually provide support and structural support for these neurons. Now nearly 86 billion neurons, they work together within the nervous system to communicate with the rest of the body. So this is a very huge number. In a single human individual, you can actually expect 86 billion neurons which work together to give you a perfect signaling system. Now they are responsible for everything. The 86 billion neurons, they are responsible for everything from consciousness and thought to pain and hunger. Now the neurons, they are very similar to the other cells in the body because the neurons, they are surrounded by the cell membrane just like the other cells of the body. They have got nucleus and genes just like the other cells of the body. They have cytoplasm, mitochondria and other organelles, and the neuron carry out basic cellular processes such as the protein synthesis and the energy production. But these neurons, they have got special features that we will discuss now. If you look at the structure of the neuron, these are the major components of the neuron. You have got these dendrites, you have got the cell body, the axon, the node of Ranvier, the myelin sheath, the Schwann cells, and the axon terminals. Now let us discuss this one by one. What is the function and what is the structure of each and every part of the neuron. So the first thing that we are going to discuss is the cell body. Now when you look at the cell body, like the other cells, each neuron has got a cell body, and the cell body is also known as the soma. And this cell body contains a nucleus, the smooth enough endoplasmic reticulum, the Golgi apparatus, the mitochondria, and other cellular components. So this part of the cell, which is known as the cell body, that will be having the nucleus, the endoplasmic reticulum, the Golgi apparatus, and all of the other organelles. One of the specialized thing that you see in the neurons and not in the other cells of the body, that is known as the dendrites. Now the branch-like structure extending away from the cell body, they are known as the dendrites. And the job of the dendrites is to receive message from other neuron and allow those messages to travel to the cell body. If you look at over here, this is the cell body, and these dendrites, they are actually extensions from the cell body. What happens is that the neuron, the signals the neuron receive, that is on these dendrites. So when these dendrites, they receive the signal, that signal is actually passed towards the cell body. So these are the dendrites, the extensions from the cell body, and you will not see these dendrites in other cells of the body. Now these dendrites can have small protrusions which are known as the dendritic spines, and the function of these dendritic spines is to increase the surface area for possible connections with other neurons. Another important component that you see in the neurons and not in the other cells of the body, that is known as the axon. Now an axon, at its most basic, is a tube-like structure that carries an electrical impulse from the cell body to the axon terminal, which then pass the impulse to another neuron. If you look at over here, when the dendrites that receive a message, that message travels towards the cell body. Now this particular another extension from the cell body, that is known as the axon, and if you can see over here, starting from here moving up to here, this whole structure is actually called is the axon. Again, this axon is an extension of the cell body. Now what are the if the dendrites, they are the extensions from the cell body, if the axons, they are the extensions from the cell body, what is the difference between the two? We'll have a detailed discussion on this. But at this particular time, keep in mind that the dendrites, when they receive a message, that message is going to move toward the cell body, and the axon, that is going to take the message away from the cell body. Now the cell body, it contains a specialized structure called is the axon hillock, which serves as the junction between the cell body and the axon. So the junction between the cell body and the axon, that will be called is the axon hillock. The myelin sheath, it is also one of the important features of the of some of the neuron. It is not present in all of the neuron, but some axons, they are covered with myelin. And this myelin is a fatty material that wraps around the axon to form the myelin sheath. This means that this fatty myelin is actually covering the axon. It is providing its function is as insulation. It functions as an insulation to minimize the dissipation of electrical signals, so it travels down the axon. Now the importance of the myelin is that myelin's presence on the axon that greatly increases the speed of the conduction of electrical signal, because the fat prevents any electricity from leaking out. I'll show you the structure of the myelin in a while. Now this myelin, this myelin insulation is also important because some of the axons from the human motor neuron that can be as long as 1 meter. from the base of the spine to the toes. So if the length of the axon that is very long, and if there is no insulation of it, that means that the speed of the message that can be compromised. So this insulation, it actually ensures that if the length of the axon that is long, the speed of the message that will not be compromised. Now, periodic gaps in the myelin sheath are called nodes of the Ranvier. That doesn't mean that all of the structure of the axon that is covered by this myelin sheath. There are periodic gaps in the myelin sheath which are called as the nodes of Ranvier. Now, at these nodes, the signal is recharged as it travels along the axon because they contain the ion channels. I'll show you the diagram in a while for the myelin sheath and where the nodes of Ranvier they are present. Another important part of the nervous system, they are known as the glial cells. And these glial cells, they are the non-neuronal part. They are not in part of the neuron. They are actually the supporting cells for the neurons. Now, the myelin sheath that we just discussed, that is not actually part of the neuron. The myelin is produced by the glial cells. They are simply called as the glia or glue in Greek. And these glial cells, they are non-neuronal cells that provide support for the nervous system. Now, if you talk about the functions of this glia, the glia functions to hold the neuron in place. Hence, their Greek name glue is used for them. So, the function of one of the important function of the glia is to hold the neuron in place. The glial cell, they provide nutrients to the neurons. They provide insulation in the form of the myelin sheath, and they are also responsible to remove pathogens and dead neuron. Now, in the central nervous system, the glial cells that form the myelin sheath, they are called as the oligodendrocytes. Now, in peripheral nervous system, they are called as the Schwann cells. We usually divide the nervous system into the central nervous system and in the peripheral nervous system that we will discuss. So, in the central nervous system, the glial cells that form this myelin sheath, they are known as the oligodendrocytes, while the glial cells of the peripheral nervous system, they are called as the Schwann cells. Now, if you look at over here, this one is the axon that we just discussed, a long structure extending from the cell body. And these blue coating that you see over here, they are actually the myelin sheath, and these gaps in this myelin sheath, they are actually known as the nodes of the Ranvier. So the axon, it starts from here, it is going to end over here. So most part of the axon that is covered by this myelin sheath, but there are gaps in the myelin sheath which are known as the nodes of the Ranvier. And these nodes of the Ranvier, there are ion channels which are actually responsible for recharging the signal so that it do not dissipate in the process of transmission. Now, in this particular thing, you can see that as I've told you that in the central nervous system, the glial cell, they are known as the oligodendrocytes, and you can clearly see that oligodendrocyte in this particular image. The other important, or the last important part of the neuron cells or the neuron, that is the presynaptic, or which is also known as the axon terminal. So the axon terminal or the presynaptic terminal, that is one and the same thing. Now, part of the neuron that releases the neurotransmitter, as I've showed you that the neurotransmitters, they are present in the neurotransmitter vesicles. So the axon terminal, that is actually responsible for the release of these neurotransmitters from the vesicles into the synaptic cleft when they receive a message. Now, as I've told you that the axons and the dendrites, both of them, they are the extensions from the cell body. So how to differentiate between the axon and the dendrites then? Now, the axons, they take information away from the cell body, while the dendrites, they bring information to the cell body. This is one of the basic difference between the two, that one is taking information away from the cell body. These are the axons. The other one, the dendrites, they are actually bringing information to the cell body. The structure of the axon, that is smooth because of the presence of the myelin sheath, and the structure of the dendrites, that is actually rough because of these dendritic spines over here. Now, if you talk about the number, generally there is only one axon per neuronal cells, and but when you talk about the number of the dendroids, usually many dendritic cells, they are present in a single neuron. The axons, they do not have any ribosomes. The dendroids, they do have the ribosomes. The axons, as I've told you, most of them, they are having this myelin sheet. The dendroids, they are not insulated. They are not, you can say, covered with the myelin sheet. The axons, they branch further from the cell body, so they are moving away from the cell body, and the dendroids that actually branch near the cell body. So in the next video, I'll be talking about the types of the neuron. So if you like this video, please subscribe to my channel, hit the like button, and share it with your friends.